Last week, the CSO published data for overseas travel to Ireland for the first 6 months of the year. It makes for impressive reading and was widely welcomed. So we're going to take a look in some detail at how things are going out there in the industry to see if that buoyancy is being reflected on the ground. To help us do that, we're joined by Angela Rutledge from Woodstock and Mallochny's restaurants in Dublin, and by Paul Carty, the Managing Director of the Guinness Storehouse. Now, to keep things balanced, we're also joined by phone by Michael Rosney, owner of the Killeen House Hotel in Killarney. So first of all, the overall picture. Visitor arrivals for the month of June itself were up 15% on last year, so it was a very strong month. That growth came from Britain, which was up an impressive 16%. North America was up 17%, while continental Europe was up 14%, with the rest of the world showing 6% growth. But let's concentrate on the full half year, that is, the period January to June. So how did that turn out, Paul?
Yes, Eamon, very, very impressive kick-off to the year. Well, overall, we've had almost 3.5 million visitors arrive up to the end of June. That's up 10.3% on last year. That's actually the best first half year since 2009. And you know, it's not far short of the best first half year ever, which was in 2007, where we had 3.7 million visitors arrive to Ireland. But taking a deeper look at this year's figures, Britain was up 14%, a remarkable recovery. North America was up 11%, and that's on top of a record year last year. Continental Europe was up a more modest 6%, while the rest of the world was up 10%. So overall, that's an additional 324,000 overseas visitors for the first 6 months of this year. A really great performance.
Now, Michael Rosney, that's a really impressive first half, but you've done some further analysis of those growth figures, and what have you found?
Yeah. It surely is, Eamon. It is a fantastic result year to date for us all, and I think all of us in the industry have every right to be very happy with the outcome. But you know, there are a few interesting things that I think are worth looking at, and certainly they jumped out at me a little bit. Of the additional 324,000 visitors that Paul mentioned there, over half of them, 76,000, 54% of them to be precise, came from next door. They came from the UK market. A further 55,000, which is approximately 17% of them, came from North America. And almost 40,000, which is 12% of the increase, came from Germany. And here's another very interesting thing about those stats. Germany produced almost 60% of all of the growth out of Europe in the first 6 months of the year so far. Now, I don't want to bore anybody with figures or blind anybody with science, but it's very interesting to see that the top three markets here in Ireland, and they've always been our top three markets, Britain, North America and Germany, between them they produced 2/3 of all of the visitors to Ireland in the first 6 months of the year. And as well as that, they also produced 83% of all of the growth, which are two outstandingly important statistics as far as I'm concerned. So when you look at it in its overall context, it is a very, very good picture for the first half of the year. We have every right to be happy. But I think you could probably say, if you drill down a little bit, continental Europe is ever so slightly disappointing relative to the other big markets, given that there was this emphasis of growth out of Germany, and given that a major player like France was down 5%.
That's interesting indeed, Michael. So coming to you, Angela, all of this growth must be good news for the restaurants. How are you finding things in Dublin?
Well, as you know, Eamon, our restaurants are in the burbs, so I'm delighted to be here talking to you about tourism in the suburbs. Things are doing well generally in Clontarf. We are really capitalising on the celebration of the millennium of 1014. And there's a nice little synergy developing there between local hotels and guest houses and restaurants in the area. But in Dublin generally, it's going well. There are lots of tourists about, and it's great to see it because we're all working really hard. And I think this success it's about all the work of many different organisations and grassroots festivals and bigger tourist destinations all coming together to bear fruit.
That's good to hear. And Paul, is the buoyancy we're speaking of, has that been experienced at the Storehouse and in other visitor attractions as well?
Yes, Eamon, I had a call around to the attractions both here in Dublin and around the country, and we're holding up. We're about 10% up on the same period last year. North America and Canada is up 24%. The UK is up 25%. And Germany is up 10%, exactly to Michael Rosney's point earlier on.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're experiencing that, and I'm delighted to say that the other attractions are in and around between 8 and 10% up on the same period last year. So certainly good news from the attractions.
That's good. And Michael, back to you. Up to this year, the tourism recovery has been a bit of a two-speed affair, really, with Dublin outpacing the rest. That appears to be changing somewhat this year. From a Kerry perspective, would you agree?
I would. I'd agree with you all right, Eamon. I'm just still basking in the glory of what Paul said there. He reeled off 5 or 6 statistics, and every one of them was preceded by up by so many percent. Isn't it bloody marvellous?
Nice to hear.
After the few years we've had. But going back to your question, yeah. As a matter of fact, if anything, I'd say we might even be moving from a 2-speed affair that you mentioned to a 3-speed affair that we mentioned, because Dublin certainly is the bright shining star. It's the one that's galloping ahead of the rest of us. And then we have these little hotspots, as they call them, around the country. Thankfully, from my perspective, on a personal level, Killarney is one of those hotspots. But you have places like Galway, Cork, Kilkenny, Kinsale, Westport, etc., etc. And they are doing quite well, and I think they're growing at pace. Not as much as Dublin, but certainly doing very well. But then there is the whole rest of the country, and that is an issue. And you know, Eamon, when we're talking about rural tourism, it is in many ways a different animal to what Paul and Angela are dealing with and living with up there. And I always say that there are 4 very, very important issues that we have to be aware of and we have to address when it comes to rural tourism. The first of them is access. Access is just so fundamentally vital. I have a phrase, AOB. When most people hear AOB, they think that any other business is the item on the agenda. When I say AOB, I mean that access is the oxygen of our business. There's no point in us having world-class tourism products on the west coast of Ireland if we can't get the market into it.
Indeed.
The second area that's very important to us is the length of stay of the visitors coming into our country from overseas. Obviously, we are remote, we are removed from the centre of activity in Dublin, so the longer people stay, the longer they get to visit the country. The third point is the average spend of the aforementioned visitors from overseas. We could fill this country with backpackers if we wanted, I'm sure, but it's very, very important that we attract a quality tourist who has discretionary income to spend. And the final point is the mobility and the penetrating power of visitors to be able to get into Ballyferret or into Ballyshannon or out into Connemara. These 4 issues are fundamentally important for rural tourism, and I think really we as an industry and our government need to pay a lot more attention to them.
Yeah. Well, that's a very passionate appeal for rural tourism from a man who I think grew up in Dublin, Michael, if I'm not mistaken, so well done.
Thank you.
Angela, back to you. Of course, we mustn't forget the all-important domestic market, and how's that been performing for the restaurants this year?
Well, Eamon, there's been a lot of exits from the market over the last few years and a lot of new entrants, but I think now finally the domestic market is holding well. And why wouldn't it, with the quality and the value that's available?
Indeed.
We're really giving people what they want now, and I look at my colleagues in the restaurant industry and I am so proud to be part of that industry. Keeping VAT at 9% has made a real difference in terms of consumer and business confidence, and it's helped us deliver on value. But let's not forget, we pay the highest catering rate in Europe, we have the highest excise duty on wine in Europe, and our food costs are 18% above the European average. In addition, there are many regulatory costs, and rates and things like licensing tables and chairs are just too high at the moment.
Sure. So indeed the cost of doing business in Ireland is close to being prohibitive in many instances, none more so than the restaurant business, I would have thought. But Angela, I have to ask you this question. Did you all survive the no-show by Garth Brooks? And was that a good weekend in Dublin anyway?
Just about. We're devastated by the loss of Garth. I think what any market needs to thrive, any exchange of goods and services for money, for people's hard-earned cash, has to have certainty. And so now we need to look at the licensing system. You can't have tickets sold subject to license anymore if the market is to thrive.
Sure, that's a very, very fair point, and one that I'm sure will be addressed, in fact, urgently. And Michael, just back to you for a minute. How about the domestic market? Killarney noted, of course, for overseas, particularly American, but domestic market was always very important to Killarney and to Kerry. How's it holding up this year?
The domestic market, Eamon, for the county of Kerry in general, constitutes about 70% of all tourism revenue.
Wow.
So it's a vitally important component. Thanks be to God, I must say that overall the spirit is good. People are feeling very optimistic. Again, within the county, we have our little hotspots. We have Killarney, we have Kinmare, we have Dingle, and I think probably it's fair to say they're doing a little bit better than the rest of the county. But overall, there's a spirit abroad, Eamon. There's an old saying that a rising tide lifts all boats, and certainly a rising barometer lifts all humours. And the good weather has been very, very important to us this year.
Sure.
As a matter of fact, I think it was your good self that initiated research last year that determined something like 20 million a day gets spent in tourism when the weather improves. We're feeling that down here.
Yeah.
There's an optimism and there's a positivity and there's a can-do attitude here in Kerry this year that I would say has been missing for the last 5 or 6 years.
That's terrific. All that's missing now is Sam, but I'm sure you may put that right in the coming weeks.
Almost a foregone conclusion, Eamon. Almost a foregone conclusion.
So, okay, well, all that is very promising, really. And now if we take a longer view back and look at the rolling 12-month period, July to June, it's an equally encouraging picture with strong upward trends across all major source markets. And that really does suggest that Ireland has finally and firmly put the tourism slump behind it. But we shouldn't forget Michael's earlier point either, that it's the big three markets, Britain, North America and Germany, that are really driving that recovery. In fact, you wanted to say something about that, Paul.
I did, Eamon. Well, just briefly to say that ITIC has always maintained that the best prospects are closer to home and that we mustn't get carried away with the tales of gold in faraway places. Now, those who were writing off the British market a short while ago really need to reflect on that. Irish tourism best prospects are bright, and our brightest future lies in the great markets of Britain, continental Europe and North America. And that's where we must continue to focus our efforts and our resources.
Indeed. And finally back to you, Angela. There's a story that sometimes gets lost behind all these tourism data that come out every now and again. And it's a great story about jobs in the Irish economy. And the news on that front is very good too, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. Between Q1 2011 and Q1 of this year, 49,000 jobs were created in the Irish economy. But it's estimated that 36,000 of those jobs were in the tourism sector. Now, that's about 70% of all the new jobs that were created between the start of 2011 and the start of this year. It's great that we're supporting exports, but we need to recognise the very real contribution that the tourism industry and the restaurant industry makes to the economy, and to focus on supporting that wherever possible through lower taxes.
Absolutely. Well, we'll leave it on that very positive note. We'll be back again in October to chat about how things turned out for the all-important third quarter, that's July, August and September. And hopefully we'll have more good news to report then.